Hello, welcome to the F50 Global Summit, Elevating Health Tech Innovation. I'm Roger Royse, partner with the international law firm of Haynes and Boone, and I'm here to moderate our panel on SynBio, synthetic biology, especially as it relates to food for health. This is part of the Global Summit, Elevating Health Tech Innovation, and our particular session has to do with agriculture technology and food technology and how that plays into health and health tech. So we've got a relatively small panel for this panel, two VCs who are very active in the area and very experienced. Let me introduce them briefly. So Ephraim Lindenbaum is a frequent speaker at our panels. He's the founder and managing partner of Advanced Ventures, which is a Silicon Valley-based investment fund investing in early stage startups. Was founded in 1999. Geez, are you that old, F? I didn't realize it's not around that long. Sustainability, communications, information technology. F serves as a board member, observer, advisor under too many companies to mention. And he's been an investor for a very long time, and I've known F for probably 25 years. Gwen Cheni is a venture partner at Fusion Fund, which is an early stage venture fund in Palo Alto, and an entrepreneur in residence at Singularity University Adventures. Before joining Singularity, Gwen was the assistant portfolio manager at a tech-focused hedge fund. She spent 18 years as a public equities analyst, started as an analyst at Goldman Sachs and an associate at JP Morgan, so she has a background in hedge funds and investment as well, is currently being a VC who is very active and very knowledgeable in the space. So thank you both for being here. I really appreciate you taking time to do this. I know you're busy, especially now. I think I'd like to start by maybe asking each of you to explain for me a little bit about what SynBio is as it relates to food and health, and how you come to the area as an investment professional. And Gwen, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So my view of SynBio is just, originally the term came from synthetic chemistry. It was coined by this guy, Tom Knight, who was a computer scientist professor at MIT. And then in his, golden years, decided to pick up biology as a hobby. So he actually went back to school, took undergraduate classes in biology, and came up with synthetic biology as a sort of a knockoff term from synthetic chemistry. So that's the backstory of how the term came about. I came into it just because I do have a background in both bio and computer science. But what really intrigued me is just the new tools that we have. So everyone's heard of CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR came about in the 1980s, 1987. But Cas9, the specific protein that allows us to make very precise cuts, did not come about until the first paper was published in 2015. So that's 5 years ago. And there's still sort of a patent dispute across 3 universities on who owns it. This is how new the technology is. And so anytime when we have a new tool, it allows us to do things that we haven't done before. And so that's what drew me to synthetic biology. The second point is the advancements in AI. Now we have, 2 large unicorns that have the biggest gene banks in the US, right? And so they're able to pick out the codes that would actually allow a particular microbe to make the exact protein that you want without making the entire organism. So these are things that weren't even possible even 2 years ago. That's what excites me.
Awesome, thank you. F, give us a little bit of background.
Sure. So we've been investing in SynBio since the mid-2000s. I think we view SynBio from the standpoint of really a left brain, right brain. We see the R&D side of it being able to utilize CRISPR, for example, as Gwen was speaking about, in regard to the R&D side, how we can, in essence, create new compounds, new technologies, and in some cases, new foods or food compounds associated with that. The other side is we view it in a very tactical sense. How can we utilize that to provide a baseline to be able to create others? And oftentimes in our case, we utilize SynBio to create the baseline behind ultimately what becomes a natural biological process. In the case of fermentation, it creates many, many different products across the food, agriculture, and even biopharma space.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think we'll start off with maybe you could give us a little bit of description of of the applications and the uses and the economics of this particular technology. How is it being used, especially in food for health? And whoever would like to start with that, I'll let you go.
Yeah, thank you. So just to jump off in that, we have a very, very appropriate company to speak about in this case. We have a company called Myco Technologies. It was founded in the mid 2010 period, about 2014, that is really utilizing a number of natural compounds with a synth bio component of that on the R&D side to do some incredibly exciting things in the protein, flavor blocker, and even nutraceutical markets. They utilize a synthebiology process that oftentimes is a liquid tissue culture side. Whereas, historically ones have looked at synth bio in purely a, let's say synthetic aspect of creating it. They use a synthetic biology process in the R&D cycle, be able to utilize and in essence map, what they're creating in a synth bio using CRISPR and otherwise into a natural process. As some people might be aware, fundamentally, synth bio is considered a GMO product. And for example, the EU limits the ability to use GMO products in a number of the different food components in other areas. So, one of the ways that we found a very effective approach to synth bio is to utilize it as an R&D technology behind the underlying, natural process that you go forward. So we can use that to identify key components, to isolate certain properties within either a natural or synthetic organism. And then certainly I think we view synth bio as well as very much the fermentation process, using either naturally derived, but yet modeled through the synth bio process, for example, on the yeast or other transitive organisms, to then in turn be utilized in Myco's case in utilizing liquid tissue mushrooms to be able to create a host of different products and create a real platform. But at the heart of all that lives a CRISPR level technology where they're utilizing that on the R&D side to identify key molecules and key processes that they'll ultimately use in the scale up.
I'll start with one portfolio company but then I'll broaden it out to, the space in general. So one of the companies I own is Lupa Bio. It's actually it's a patent attorney and a corporate attorney that used to work for a pharmaceutical company. What they found is that there is human milk. So mother's milk actually has 180 sugars. And some of the sugars actually have beneficial effects in infant. And we're actually just learning this. So what they found is that one of them is it's even safer than baking soda in the human body. It's been dosed to the higher dosage than baking soda and found to be completely safe. What they found is that it has anti-inflammatory effects. It lowers IL-1, IL-6, and IL-9, which is actually the same cytokine storm that's causing COVID. So this same company is applying for COVID designation as well for anti-inflammatory cytokine storm. But at the same time, they can be added to infant milk formula, but they are also going for a pharmaceutical FDA approval as an autoimmune disease pharmaceutical. And because of the safety studies that have already been done, both in animals and in humans in South Korea and in Europe, the FDA cleared them for phase 1 without doing any phase 1 and said, you can go straight to phase 2. So this is, the first seed company I invested in where, they got immediate IND past phase 1 and going straight to phase 2. So, I mean, there's a lot. I know the topic here is food, but there's actually a lot of overlap between food and pharma at this point. I guess broadening it out, what really excites me about this space is that even 5 years ago, we did not have the fermentation capacity that we have today, just like Ephraim talked about. I think the other super exciting part is, Twist Bio, which is actually a public company. A base pair used to cost $10. Now it's less than 10 cents. And it's on the way down to 1 penny that you can just order it online. You can literally click the base pairs that you want and you get it in the mail, right? And so this is, what excites me about this is that this is going to push innovation forward. This is what's going to allow startups to actually happen. So one of the companies I work with is actually Ginkgo Bioworks. And so they have the biggest gene bank probably in the world without knowing what China has. And they can go through high throughput screening like nobody's business, right? They have their 4th foundry and potentially a 5th foundry now. This did not exist prior to 2014, right? And so these are all the things that, these are all the big tools that we have to push innovation forward. So now instead of having to build your own Ginkgo Bioworks foundry, you can contract with them. And the contracts are not in millions, but only 6 figures, sometimes 5, right? And so this makes a seed stage company possible. And that's what really excites me about innovation in the space. I guess the third point about clarifying, there's been a lot of talk about food beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, and now Memphis Meats. I think what consumers don't understand is that there's been, between the 3 of those names, there's been huge progress that's happened. So Beyond Burger is really plant protein, and they're trying to make it taste better. That's Beyond. Impossible is still plant protein, but what they've done is they've used synthetic biology to create the heme, so that's the part that bleeds. So you have one component from SynBio in that entire Impossible Burger. And Memphis Meats is trying to take one cell from the animal, multiply that cell, and that's the meat, right? And so even though they're all, sort of on the green spectrum, the amount of technology that's gone into each one of them is, exponential. So that's the other part that I think is missed by consumers, but it really excites me as a investor.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that myself with what these meats are all about, and if they're the same, if they're different, I guess some are fake meat. Well, that's not a good name, but staying with you a little bit on that topic, when it sounds like things are happening like really quickly here. Is this, and it seems like a new technology to me. I mean, I don't remember hearing a lot about it. Is this one of the kind of the big new things that's going to change things radically that just came from out of nowhere? Or is this something that's been around for a long time and we've got history and we can kind of predict where it's going?
I think I think the interesting point is we're at a stage where where experimentation can happen. I think what allows startups to work is that iteration process. So that means each iteration, the cost has to be relatively low, right? And so we're finally at that point. And Ephraim talked about this earlier with fermentation. I'm actually seeing this on the foundry side, which is on the gene editing and high throughput screening side. I think in the past, if you had a SynBio startup, you had one shot on goal. You raised $5 million, you had one shot on goal. If you missed it, you're done, right? Whereas here, you can raise $1 million and you can have 10 shots on goal, which makes your probability of success a lot higher and actually makes you VC investable. Instead of, one shot on goal is probably, your uncle's money or somebody, like it has to be high net worth. And so I think that's the difference in business model that.
Yeah, and just to add what Gwen was saying is, really this has been a democratization and a reduction in cost of technology. I mean, for a long period of time, CRISPR and even advanced or even non-advanced gene editing has been the provenance of, research institutions, biopharma, incredibly well-funded organizations. And fundamentally, this has come down in terms of cost. And, while this was really the providence of biopharma and human or even animal therapeutics, this has now moved down over the last 10 years into the space where it can be used in what we would look at as much lower price per unit models like the food or agriculture space, and use this technology to drive it to the point where you can achieve it. Now, there are different approaches, and I'm glad you brought up Memphis Meats and Beyond and Impossible. And it was really great how Gwen sort of explained to a large degree how they're very different approaches to very similar challenge out there, and how SynBio played a unique role in each of them, probably maybe less so with the Beyond Meat, for example, much more so with the Memphis Meat, and how that very broad cast will allow it there. And then the piece that we just touched on in terms of fermentation becomes a huge part of it, because the ability to scale up all of this technology to production scale becomes very, very interesting. I mean, to a large degree, Beyond Meat, for example, does still utilize yellow pea and other types of more traditional protein sources, whereas you get to someone like Memphis Meats, and that is completely fermented technology. So, not only has this R&D side developed and democratized to bringing it down to the price point where startups and others can use it, but moreover, fermentation in the process of scaling up has now been attached to that in such a way that you can use the yield that's coming out of R&D and find a mechanism for action and a pathway to be able to scale this into a real business. And that's something as well that's really evolved over the last 10 years on the advancements in the fermentation side and continuous sterilization and a lot of elements of that brings us to a real reality at scale.
Yeah, how are the consumers reacting to this? One of the themes that's come up in our panels in this conference is the rise of consumerism, and how consumer attitudes are changing and how it's different and how they want this, they want that. All of a sudden now this is important. And I think of this and it sounds, I don't know if it is GMO, but that's what it sounds like. And I know that's a bad word, in a lot of places. How has the consumer market been accepting this, or is it just too weird?
I'll take that because I brought it up first. I think it is unfortunate that GMO is something that SynBio has to deal with, even though it's not a stigma that SynBio created. The whole stigma around GMO came about when plant seeds, crop seeds were engineered so that they can survive higher pesticides. And then pesticides were sprayed on those plants, on those crops. And then humans eat them and we have adverse healthcare outcomes because of it, right? So that is one adverse usage of GMO. I think there's been thousands of applications of positive applications of GMO that's not talked about, right? Like, seedless watermelon is something that we bring up a lot. In some ways, dogs is a GMO, right? Is that we bred the really nice wolves and now we have dogs, right? And so, what is accelerated evolution and what's GMO? The distinction is it's a fine one. So I would say that not all GMO is bad, but at the same time, I definitely agree with sort of a global need to police certain aspects of GMO. I think editing human cells, we're not there yet, and I think those aspects should definitely be controlled. But there's so many things that we know how to do quite well. Whether it's a yeast cell, whether it's engineering E. coli, we know those extremely well.
And that's a good point. I'd love to add to what Gwen was saying about that, which is, when you think about GMO from the standpoint of truly a modified organism, beyond some of the categories in the seed industry and so on that she was talking about, the natural side of GMO, which is technically not considered GMO, it's actually natural breeding, is really what's used in most cases. I mean, if we look at everything from a Driscoll berry to, many seedless watermelons and others, those may have been identified through a genetic process, actually utilizing CRISPR, Cas9, and other forms of R&D tech to understand how to follow a roadmap to reach a particular outcome. That's how we're doing it. So for example, our company, let's say Myco, their products are not GMO because they really haven't utilized an actual gene editing process. What they've used it for, and this was very much along Gwen's thought process on looking at large genetic banks and so on, they utilize it to understand where they need to take natural replication in order to achieve it, right? So you have this very unique model that's come up where you can really use what we would look at today as, CRISPR and other forms of technology to map a process that then you can take down to natural evolution. And the natural evolution, dogs are a great example. I mean, certain fruits, vegetables, et cetera, are really ideal. Historically, those took years. You'd essentially breed a tomato, one would come out purple, you'd isolate that plant, and you'd keep breeding and breeding and breeding over successive thousands of generations till every tomato ended up purple coming off that plant. Today, what we're able to do with genes and so on is be able to peer into it, find that particular gene that makes that tomato purple, isolate that much quicker, and collapse the cycle of thousands of generations into maybe only several generations. So you're able to essentially find the root process to drive that outcome much, much faster. And that really changes, the dynamic. It allows us to identify, really high value properties, like Gwen was saying, for example, in human mother's milk. It also allows us to create profiles. So in the case of proteins, matching protein profiles with, let's say, traditional meat proteins or traditional, blended proteins are very, very important. Today, we've sort of taken what's available off the shelf in terms of yellow pea or soy or other forms of proteins that are out there like hemp, and we've utilized them as such. Maybe we've done some genetic, either true GMO or natural breeding to achieve optimization, but still you're dealing with a very small slice of the perfect protein pie. There's a tremendous amount of amino acids and so on that come out of animal proteins that are very hard to be matched. Now, There are, advanced protein sources like we're talking about, for example, using mycelia or mushrooms or others that are evolving today, which have a much more, meat-like amino acid profile. So they're far healthier. And when you talk about health, you're able to get the ideal profile without many of the other things that are carcinogenic that are essentially associated with animal proteins. You can eliminate things like high cholesterols and other elements like that that may be coming out of pork or other proteins by just utilizing these ideal amino acid profiles. Then your body's ability to digest this becomes very important. Plant-based proteins are highly digestible when compared to animal-based proteins. So the ability to, one, start with a plant, then two, be able to model and or identify and naturally breed the more perfect profile of that is going to create much, much higher outcomes. And to give you an idea, the cost per gram of animal protein is 40 times the cost of fermented protein in some cases. For example, our company, is working on a 1 to 1.1 input to output ratio right now. To give you an idea, animals like cows and pigs take 40 to 1 input to 1 gram of protein out. So when you talk of a global sustainability, you now have a health component, higher digestibility, healthier outcomes with the humans, and then you have a planet outcome that says it's a much lower input to output ratio. So when you talk about feeding, 10 billion people in the future, you're going to have to be able to look at these models. You're going to have to look at SynthBio as a way to collapse the speed of development and then also be able to model into scale, because without scale, everything ends up being just purely a research project.
So I heard Gwen talk about how ideally suited this is for venture capital. You're a VC. Are you excited about the space? Are you investing in it? What does the future look like? And we'll just end with both of you on that question.
Sure. So certainly, we've been investing in the space since 2004. We broadly believe that it's a very interesting space that very much parallels the evolution of information technology. Just in terms of speed, as the democratization that we've seen in information technology with the speed of the processor, networking, et cetera, we have a very similar parallel on this side, where you've got the speed of the R&D now stepping up to match the speed of the scale up. So it gets this great opportunity to create all of these new brands, all of these creative models that are out there. We've spent a lot of time talking about meat, but when we move into things like milk replacement or other forms of dairy replacements, these are incredibly meaningful from both an allergy standpoint, a health standpoint, and then also an environmental standpoint. So, this has two sides. It has a very, very meaningful economic side, the ability to create something with incredibly high margins, but also has a very beneficial earth side as well. And I think a lot of the LPs, the investors that invest in us, like to see us have that dual purpose and be able to make something very disruptive on the economic side, while at the same time making something very harmonious, if you will, on the earth side.
Got it. Gwen, I'm going to give you the last word on that question.
Yeah, sure. So I haven't started on this as early as Ephraim, but I did focus on this exclusively since December of last year. And during that time, I probably saw 250 decks in SynthBio applied across different industries. And I met with so many companies. And it's really, I totally agree with everything Ephraim is saying. It's not just food. It's there's a lot in clean tech. And I think, 5 years ago, it was a lot about clean energy, but now it's clean industrial inputs. Another portfolio company I have is making the indigo dye in jeans. For every 1 kilogram of that indigo dye, it takes 100 kilograms of petroleum and cyanide. And we don't see it because most of it is done in India and China. But the farmland, downstream from those dye plants cannot grow any crop. That's how toxic it is. And so they figured out a way to turn literally sugar into that dye with zero side effects, with zero outputs. Right. And we can bring that cost down to parity by the end of this year. So there is zero reason not to use the bio dye versus the chemical dye. So things like that really excite me. There's another company that is, so the cost is not perfectly at parity yet. It's still about 3x, but it's a biodegradable replacement to diaper, to the absorbers in diaper. It disintegrates in 6 months instead of staying in a trash pile for however many years. I think the other application that we haven't talked about is aquaculture, right? There's fish feed, there's also growing fish meal. There's also antibiotics. There's a ton of companies in that area, either in probiotics, prebiotics, or phages. There's a lot on biothin plastics. So Zymergen's a company that's been making a lot of moves in there. Lastly, on the pharma side, it really excites me. And I'm starting to see the potential in that because of COVID. Right now, the vaccines are still made via CHO cells. So it's a humanized mouse cell. If we can get yeast to make that, that is 1/50th the cost. So instead of, just divide the cost by 50. That's how much cheaper we can get the vaccine. And it's a lot faster. Instead of a 20-30 day period, it's 2 days. And we can just leave the cells growing. They grow very well in a fermenter. So once we perfect the science, there's a lot of potential for SynBio on the healthcare side as well.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you panelists for being here at our Global F50 Summit, Elevating Health Tech Innovation, for this great discussion on food for health, SynBio. I certainly learned a lot. I think our audience is going to appreciate it. So thank you, panelists, thank you, attendees, and I'm going to turn it back to you, F50.